Super. Time for our next session. And we're talking about the impact of COVID, the key trends in e-commerce as we talk about, because 2020 for that matter, and this whole global pandemic has brought about a new set of consumer trends and understanding of the consumer, both in the retail and the e-commerce space. So joining us, we have with us Suraj Dhillon, who's the National Director e-commerce with GroupM. So firstly, good afternoon, Suraj. Wonderful to have you join us here.
Good afternoon, Kavya.
Thank you very much indeed. And so without any delay, we're going to hand over the session to you and let's get to understand the key trends in e-commerce from you. Over to you, Suraj.
Awesome. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me here today. To start off, it's sort of been a surreal past 5 to 6 months, and we've had the other speakers also speak about the various changes that we've seen in our environment today, where time spent online by consumers has increased rapidly. Digital payments have soared, and spurred by repeated and lengthy lockdowns, there's been a noticeable shift in terms of retail purchases to online channels. But questions still remain on what has actually been the quantitative impact in terms of various stages of the purchase funnel. Are we seeing signs of stickiness, or is there a temporary shift? We saw the panel discussion where that topic was debated. And also, what is the kind of consumer sentiment towards future purchases? More importantly, aside from the consumer, we also look at the other partners in the value chain or the other players in the value chain, like retailers and platforms. How is it impacting their behavior? And sorry, just give me a second. Yeah. And therefore, to try and answer these questions, we'd be looking at 5 key trends across platform, retailer, as well as consumer behavior. And our aim at the end of it is to see that how we can link these trends to certain actionables in terms of how brands should respond to them. Now, to start off, and before diving into the trends, what I'd like to look at is the kind of impact that we've seen at an overall growth level, as well as from a value penetration level of the online space. So overall, e-tail has, according to sources, grown by approximately 24 to 25% if you compare June, July versus pre-COVID. If you look at the grocery space specifically, that's almost doubled in terms of size and doubled in terms of value penetration. And non-grocery, while the offline space has seen a drop of approximately 60% because mobility of consumers to non-grocery retail as well as recreation stores has also dropped by 60%. What we've seen online is that we've seen a growth of around 20%. And because of that, we've seen penetration levels in terms of value of non-grocery really skyrocketing, almost tripling from an 8% level to a 25-26% level. Now, while we've seen what the value impact and the penetration impact has been, a question which arises is what's the source of growth of this particular growth? And what's the kind of contribution which consumers doing their first purchases online have to this particular growth story? And if we look at the data, around 20% of consumers who made purchases, e-retail purchases during this particular period were new consumers. If you look at it from an e-FMCG perspective, that number rises to around 33%. More importantly, these new consumers, because of various systemic issues and otherwise, made their first purchases in grocery or beauty, almost 30% of them. And when we compare it to the earlier state, where primarily new customer acquisition used to happen in categories such as electronics and in fashion, this is a significant shift. Now, coming to where these consumers are actually coming from, almost 74% of them are coming from tier 3 and below cities. While the earlier split was very similar in terms of 68%, what we need to note is that if we specifically look at the e-grocery space, we see that currently metros and tier 1 cities approximately contribute to 9 to 10% of total e-grocery within metros. But for tier 2 and below cities, that number is as low as 0.1%. And therefore, with new models and greater potential reach in the space, this number would see a significant shift. Now, to start off with our trends, the first trend that we'll focus on is the consumer's choice and usage of platforms. And here what we see is that customer growth across platforms as compared to overall customer growth is higher, which indicates that consumers are using multiple platforms. Now, while during the period of, say, April to June, there may have been instances with respect to availability and delivery issues which force consumers to explore other platform options. What we also feel is that a major trend which is playing a role is that consumers are planning their purchases more, they're seeking more incremental value. This was alluded to also in the earlier discussions, and that is a major reason also for this particular shift. Another reason also is that earlier for grocery purchases, there were certain customer behaviors from either a top-up or a basket purchase, which has also moved on to instant purchases. And therefore, multiple platforms with different operational models and different benefits that they provide to the consumer are increasing in terms of usage. Two other great trends that we see here is that customer growth is generally higher for the top players as compared to lower user-based players. And more importantly, consumers are purchasing from multiple verticals and categories. And this is a trend that we'll explore later as well in greater detail. Now, coming to trend number 2, consumers are relying more on marketplaces for product research. And if we look at the stats in terms of there's been approximately a 60% increase in terms of average daily search volume. The number of products viewed by consumers has increased by approximately 41%. And more importantly, the amount of time that consumers are spending on e-commerce portals has increased by 37%. Now, an interesting nuance to this time is that earlier, the time spent by consumers used to be skewed towards specific time slots. So for example, for women, it used to generally be in the afternoons. For men, it used to be primarily in late evenings. But what has happened to this skew is that it's sort of flattened out, sort of evened out. And therefore, what it provides is a more uniform distribution in terms of time slots when consumers actually browse and purchase on platforms. Now, we've looked at how consumer behavior overall has changed. An interesting point to note there was that we saw that we approximately saw 60% in terms of increased searches. Your overall value has increased by 20%. While there may be a role which is played there from a down trading perspective, the primary reason why this has happened, as I mentioned, was because consumers are researching more. And a trend which evolves from this is that it would not only have an online impact. And this was again alluded to in the earlier panel discussion. In fact, according to a GroupM consumer survey of metro upper middle income consumers, almost 49% of consumers actually browse online and then do their purchases offline. So once we see even non-grocery opening up, mobility increasing towards non-grocery stores, the actions that you take in terms of the awareness and consideration level specifically for consumers online will have an impact in terms of your offline purchases as well. Coming to trend number 3, and we've covered platform usage, we've covered pre-purchase behavior. Now we'll focus on purchase behavior specifically. And the questions which generally arise are consumers widening their purchases across categories? Are they buying more frequently? Are consumers shopping more per order? And the answer to all these questions is yes. So we've seen almost a 40% increase in the number of subcategories purchased by the customer. The frequency has increased by approximately 10%. And if we look at the FMCG space specifically, where average order values generally used to be in the range of around 600 to 700 rupees, that has actually increased on platforms to almost 800 to 900 rupees. An interesting trend also here is that it's not only restricted to repeat customers, but also consumers who are doing their purchases online for the first time. In fact, consumers who made their first purchases online in the month of April, we saw that approximately 40% of those consumers went on to make full basket purchases in the subsequent months. And by full basket purchases here, what I mean is that you have at least 4 items in your cart and you have a minimum order value of around 900 rupees. So this is not only restricted to repeat consumers, but we are seeing also new consumers showing some signs of initial stickiness. So though it's still awaited to see once mobility opens up completely, whether this trend holds or not. Now while we've seen that there has been an increase in terms of the number of subcategories purchased, in terms of the average order value, and in terms of overall value, what we see when we drill down to the kind of products which are purchased is that we still see that consumers are definitely still prioritizing fundamentals over certain discretionary spends. So while we look at categories and changes in entertainment, dining out, and work mobility levels leading to spikes in products for home office setups, for kitchen goods, for appliances, and home entertainment. But at the same time, there are categories such as fashion and beauty which still remain a bit subdued. Uh, in fact, a McKinsey consumer survey shows that approximately 90% of consumers believe their finances will be impacted for more than 2 months. And if you look at this from a 4-month window, or minimum 4-month window, that number stands at a whopping 68%. And this definitely has an impact on discretionary spends at an overall level. While the skew may currently be there towards online because of systemic issues, it remains to be seen that once it opens up, how exactly will this maintain? Another interesting trend which which I'd like to point out is because of this sort of uncertainty and because of concerns on unemployment and recession, there are signs that there is short-term trading down which is happening. In fact, around 45% of consumers who plan to reduce their spends actually are looking at cheaper brands and variants to purchase. And this is an interesting trend to keep an eye on, and whether this sustains, it remains to be seen. The fifth trend that we like to focus on is from a platform as well as from a model perspective. Also linking in with respect to how retailers are playing a role in this entire piece. So 3 clear trends, and we've spoken about this earlier in the panel discussions also. Hyperlocal, the explosion of hyperlocal delivery models such as Swiggy, Zomato, Dunzo. Swiggy brought in their Instamart capabilities, where essentially they're having a dark store model which they're launching. We also had Flipkart launch their quick service. We've also seen various non-traditional categories from a hyperlocal perspective, such as smartphone players like Xiaomi, actually utilizing their existing network of retailers to deliver an important consumer benefit of instant deliveries and also reaching out to consumers during this time. The second piece that I'd like to speak about is on online B2B or eB2B. And here also we've seen significant movement on existing players as well as major entrants, and we've in fact seen announcements in the form of JioMart's hybrid model and also in terms of Flipkart's ambitions in this space. The third trend is the rise of D2C models across consumer brands and retails. And as Pawan mentioned earlier as well, these have been enabled through multiple avenues, from traditional avenues like websites and apps, also through new models such as WhatsApp and conversational commerce. In fact, if I just spend a couple of seconds on conversational commerce, this has become very important for assisted selling models such as beauty and fashion, and it's played a major role in terms of bridging that gap from a recommendation perspective, which generally a beauty advisor would do. And in fact, the industry is projected to be almost around $10 million by next year. Now, while we've looked at what are the models that platforms have brought in and the explosion of these marketplace models which are there, the question also arises on the supply end with respect to the evolution of retailers for these models. And here we clearly see a trend in terms of digitization of kiranas. And in fact, 40% of kiranas want to partner with online delivery platforms. If we look at retailers who actively use a POS terminal for their store, that number has gone up from 11% pre-COVID to 21%. And for retailers who earlier were non-eB2B users, with respect to their openness of using eB2B services, that number has shot up from a whopping 7% to a 50%. So clearly a trend on both sides. And this is definitely something that will evolve into a much mature model in the future. So we've looked at platform behavior, we've looked at pre-purchase behavior and purchase behavior from the consumer perspective. We've also looked at what are the changes that platforms have made to their models, and we've also looked briefly in terms of what's the openness of retailers in terms of their behavior. So once we've identified all these trends, we have to look at how exactly we can link them back to actionables which brands can do in terms of ensuring that they are ready for this changing climate. And in terms of that, one major aspect that brands need to evaluate is that they need to analyze their consumer part to purchase, and therefore, basis that, evaluate and expand into new platforms or craft omni-channel strategies by integrating hyperlocal models, etc. But step number one remains crucial. More importantly is that we've already spoken about the time skew change, and therefore it becomes very important that we have an always-on approach with continuous marketing investments. And we also spoke about the entire pre-purchase research trends earlier, and therefore it's important to focus on e-com not only from a sales perspective, but also from an opportunity to drive awareness and consideration as well. The second part that we looked at was pre-purchase research. And there we heard our panelists earlier talking about the importance of improving buyability through enhanced content and a compelling story on your product pages and your stores. It's very important to review this product content to address current customer concerns. And this ties into the entire piece that is not only going to have an impact in terms of your online purchases, but also on your offline purchases as well. More importantly, from a purchase and spends priority perspective, we've seen that consumers are more obviously more value conscious because of the fears that we spoke about. There are certain categories which have lesser demand as compared to other categories. And therefore, if you're working in a category which has lesser demand and you also have popular products along with it, look at bundling these products together in order to maintain sales and increase trials. More importantly, for popular products, look at range bundling. So you may have primary variants which are selling right now. It's important to try and push through your other ranges as well, where you're able to offer a value to the consumer, but at the same time drive portfolio trials. More importantly also is that in case you're constrained with respect to your discounting strategy, look at it from a segmented communication perspective and align your discounting strategy accordingly. I would like, so very brief presentation, key trends and key actionables basis that, and therefore I would like to leave you with the final thought that change is inevitable, except from a vending machine. In fact, we see that marketing innovation has hardly seen a more widespread and rapid pace of deployment. And so what we need to do is that we need to reevaluate quickly where we stand on our e-commerce maturity journey. And more importantly, our internal ways of working, to ensure that we embrace this agility in this rapidly changing landscape. Thank you for your time. Happy to connect later, obviously, to answer any questions you might have. And thank you once again.